Okay, so this is Think and Link. We are live in front of a nice little live audience in a virtual universe and any number of other places. And we put on this event once a month. We bring on wonderful guests, and you might notice that we are missing one of those guests. She's come down with illness. Barbara has informed us yesterday that she's out sick, so we will see her in a future event. But before I say too much more, I want to make sure we cover off on our sponsors on this. So we have two sponsors, Lake One, which is a HubSpot implementation partner, phenomenal company, phenomenal partner and client. Rem5, which puts in that virtual environment that all of you have been tooling around in and speaking and awkwardly, figuring out your social things in that wonderful world. And then RSB Architects, which is the building we're in, which have been both clients and friends for a while and great sponsors. And then of course, Capsule, which is a special projects agency here in Minneapolis. And we've been doing this for, well, more than a decade, might be a decade and a half, the speaker series. Have been phenomenal across the board. And we get to share wonderful insights and perspectives from our guests. And we have my guest co-host, Rick Coppola. For the local audience, they would know him perhaps from way back when, not too far back, but far back enough, Carolina. And so he's a professional at this. And then also as founder of Bring Me the News and then IE Networks, and phenomenal entrepreneur. And then Joy Howard, who, and I refer to this very affectionately, I have been stalking for a very long time in the digital universe because of all the things she's done, as she was there when we were originally hired at Patagonia, and said this wonderful phrase that we'll talk about a lot, a wonderful quote, which is Patagonia the company and Patagonia the brand are the same thing. And the fact that she could say that she should say that it was a thing to say that, because we've all interacted with those companies that are a little bit different than you'd expect, perhaps in a bad way. Patagonia is not. Everything you expect Patagonia to be, they are when you get there and hang out and so many levels. So we have a wonderful conversation coming up. But first, I'm going to hand it over to Joy to give a little bit more background on herself and currently where she is residing in the world as well. Joy, take it away.
Thank you, Aaron. It's so great to be reconnected with you. And I'm thrilled to be on this webcast thing that we're doing. So I'm Joy, and I am the founder and CEO of a very early stage startup called Early Majority. We are a membership-based outdoor brand. And before that, and this company, by the way, is very much the result of my experience as the time that I spent at Nike, where I was the head of marketing for Converse All-Star, which people basically call Chuck Taylor, and also the first head of marketing at Patagonia, where Aaron and I met. And before that, I actually worked in what Americans call CPG and what people on this side of the pond, I'm in Paris now, but people in the UK and in Europe will call FMCG, which stands for fast moving consumer goods. I was at the Coca-Cola company. I actually started out at Johnson & Johnson after getting one of the very first MBAs in sustainable enterprise all the way back in 2002. If you can imagine, we were focused on sustainability back then. I definitely was. After I left Patagonia, I spent some time in the world of venture-backed technology. So I was the chief marketing officer at Sonos and also at Lyft, and then joined a small software company here in Paris as a way of working my way into starting my own company, which is what I've been doing for the last couple of years.
I love that you've applied all that stuff to becoming an entrepreneur, which we'll talk about too. There's a lot of stuff to talk about there. That's really fascinating. But I want to also give Rick a chance to introduce himself for those who don't know him, and also introduce what you're currently working on, your current venture and what it's all about, because it's also very fascinating.
Well, thanks. Just briefly, Rick Coppola, in this Twin Cities for almost 35 years now, 21 as an anchor and investigative reporter with the NBC station here at Gannett Property at the time, and had almost 30 years in news in New York and Washington, and Minneapolis is home base for a very long time. And in the last, it's been 15 years since I left, that anchor slot. And in the 15 years since, we launched one of the very earliest iterations of curated news back in 2009 for a digital platform. This concept of why does an NBC affiliate only report what NBC is reporting? Or maybe the AP, but I mean, if CBS has a scoop, how do you not reference that? I mean, you're going to let people just kind of stumble into that? You got to report on what's going on. So we launched this digital platform to do the same. We built a radio network around it. We sold it a few years ago. And IE Network, the Informed Engagement Network, is an organization that works with major global brands around research, strategy, and content production designed to move audiences to specific beliefs and actions. Okay. And at the end of the day, if there's a secret sauce in it, I'm doing what I've always done. And that is to bring journalists around me to conduct the market research in a way that is very different from what market research usually looks like. It's open-ended investigative inquiry that leads us to conclusions and recommendations that are fact-based. And so that's what I've been doing, kind of where I am. And Aaron, I really appreciate the opportunity to join you here today. I mean, I've been able to participate in this before, and it's a wonderful opportunity again. And just getting to meet Joy, I told her before everybody came on here, I spent most of yesterday just deep in Joyland online. She's everywhere.
Joyland. Pull quote Joyland. That's funny. Okay, so let's first talk about, which usually we leave to the end of a conversation because it's a really painful question, but because you're Joy and because of your phenomenal intellectual capacity, we thought we'd put it first as what is in your mind good design? What do you think is an example of good design, or what is a definition of good design in your world?
Well, I'm sure there have been, and I know for a fact there have been whole books written about this. So I'm going to give you not an expert's point of view, but my very subjective perspective, which is very rooted in what I'm doing right now, and that is making apparel. And so good design in apparel is basically a product that allows you to have something that fewer of something that's better, and something that's longer lasting. And I call that sort of like a design result, because so much of what's really dominated the apparel business is this push towards, more faster, cheaper stuff. And that's not really what people want. People want things that fewer things. They want better things. They want things that are long lasting. And the fewer and better, they really draw on very difficult to implement design principles like modularity, multifunctionality. Those are very important. But longer lasting is also really important. And it relates to less the functional aspects of design, which is what I've just described, right? These are kind of functional attributes, but more the feeling that you get from something that has been very well designed. And that's, quite simply a feeling of joy. I mean, I think when something's well designed, you use it for a long time and you take pleasure in that relationship that you build, with that thing or with that experience. And so I think pleasure and joy are a really big part of good design as well.
Elegant answer. I knew that's an elegant answer. Yeah, that's beautiful. I'll let Rick ask a question, because I feel like I'm interested.
You've an extraordinary background you've had in marketing. It's just some serious global brand, one after another. And I want to make sure, is this your first at bat with your own company, or have you done that before in some iteration?
Oh no, of course, it's my very first, because the skills that are required to start a company are so different from the skills that were required to do that thing that I was doing before. I was very much the person, and this is very common for CMOs, by the way, very much the person who was called in when there was kind of a stall out, right? So like things had been going good for a while, and then suddenly, wait, they were not, we weren't having the growth that we were having before. And I would be the person that would see the potential of what was there, be able to understand why the stall out had happened, and then, get the brand and the company kind of back on the growth path. That's a completely different skill set from 0 to 1.
Yeah, that's factual what you're describing right there. And what I find among the most fascinating things about you, really, in terms of what you've done here, is you're stepping into this first at bat to fuel the growth of what you refer to as a degrowth apparel company. So can you just talk about what is that? What are you doing?
Well, I'm very hesitant to refer to it myself as degrowth, but that is how it's been described a lot in the press. And we do on the website try to explain and unpack that concept a bit. So, you know, I'll do my best to summarize what degrowth is, what it means for us,
Yes.
but also why I'm so hesitant to use that to describe a business, because, you know, the very nature of a startup is growth. Like that is what defines a startup. So the fascination, I think, especially that young people have with degrowth, comes directly out of concern about the climate crisis and this belief that we have to radically reduce our carbon emissions. And this belief that the only way to do it is to actually change the way in which we consume. Not in a way that leads us to be, you know, miserable, you know, like eating porridge by candlelight every night kind of thing. You know what I mean? But in a way that pushes us to redefine what luxury is, what extravagance is. We're publishing an essay later this week called Ethical Extravagance. What does that mean? And so really the degrowth movement, it gets a very bad rap. It's a political movement too, which is another reason why I'm a little bit hesitant to say like, we're it, you know, because I don't think companies should try to co-opt political movements. At the same time, they do have a valuable role to play contributing to them if they are ethically aligned with them. And I do support the spirit of that movement as a person. And I think a lot of the people who are associated with the brand also really do support that movement. And I think everybody is ready to redefine this, right? This notion of what prosperity is, this notion of like, what are we doing this for? And so, I mean, we're doing, you know, this is LinkedIn is basically the platform that we use to, you know, promote this program. And I think work itself is facing a whole crisis of legitimacy. People are asking themselves like, why am I actually doing this? And I think, you know, we each of us needs to feel like we're making a meaningful contribution to either averting climate catastrophe or addressing economic inequality. In my humble opinion, these are the only two problems worth solving. And the degrowth movement looks at how those two are interrelated. And I think that's a really important thing for us to look at.
This is like, I mean, it's clearly not only is it a very interesting take on what the business is, which I'd love if you could take some time to just describe what you're doing and the model that you're after here, because you're innovating actually on many things at once, in my personal opinion, as I watch what you're doing. And it's just, it's interesting. Could you define kind of for us, for everybody here, what the business is about and its mission-centric relevance?
Well, and what I will say is there are a lot of perils I mean, dangers in being the first at something. First of all, it's very scary, right? And then there's that whole kind of metaphor of like, you're the one with all the arrows in your back. And another thing that can happen, which I feel a little bit better about, is that you kind of are in this position of doing like unpaid R&D for bigger companies. So we can kind of come on to that later, but first let me just explain what we're doing, because it seemed really, really weird when we first started doing it. And now you are seeing more and more of it out there, which is encouraging for me because we wanted to transform the industry that we're a part of. So it's very simple, okay? We want to make fewer, better, longer lasting garments, which is not the business model of apparel. To do that, we need a different growth model, which is our membership model. So people become members of Early Majority, and we grow by actually growing our membership rather than proliferating products. That's it at its simplest. That's what we're doing. Now, the way that we do that is when you come to the site, as soon as you start to interact with the product, you'll see that we have a membership. This was very strange. It's only been about a year and a half since we did it. It was very strange when we did it, but it's more and more common, and you're going to see more and more and more of it because it's a way for companies to establish, first of all, a different revenue stream that's not dependent on just straight product proliferation, which everybody would like, better profit margins, and a deeper relationship with their customers, which results in better LTV, long-term value, for those of you who don't like marketing acronyms. So that's what we're doing.
I love that. Yeah, the elegance of the things that you've inserted into this, I could see where there can be a lot of fear of like, we're way out in front of most of the category, that people aren't doing this stuff, but it is on the horizon. There's all kinds of tiebacks, like we're heading into an experience economy, and membership is an example of an experience where you essentially subscribe to an experience, not just to a product. It's just buying a product. You want to buy something that lasts longer. And back to your definition of design, I overlap in the fact that things that last a really long time are really good design, right? And there's a lot of things that, I mean, I used to say that, speaking to your Patagonia days and back when we had those wonderful conversations, the antithesis of Patagonia was Apple, because they exploited perceived obsolescence, right? We didn't really need new things. We just perceived that we did. And then you think about it in fashion. Fashion is like the worst exploiter of that concept, right? Is you can wait 10 years and the thing is back again, maybe less, right? It becomes fashionable again, which is really fascinating that you're pushing up against all of those norms. But you're doing for Paris, so that's good. Totally makes sense. The center of the fashion world,
we can get
right?
to that in a minute. But when you look at, like, engineered obsolescence was a breakthrough in business, a breakthrough in the consumer, business, right? It was just like, wow, we people aren't buying more nylon stockings because they last so long. That was the moment when it was unlocked, is that DuPont realized, like, hang on a minute, they had all these ads showing women's stockings are so strong you can like tow a truck with them, right? And then women were like, yeah, it's fantastic, these stockings are so strong. And then they realized, like, wait a minute, we're not going to grow anymore, so they made them less strong. And then you have runs in your nylons and you need to replace them all the time. So that was like an unlock. And this just gets to my point of, like, what are we doing here? Like, why are we in business? What is it that we're really trying to solve? Are we just trying to grow? Are we trying to grow in different ways that allow us to have a more abundant future together? And one of the things that's very popular in Europe is this right to repair, which is very anathema to Apple, and it's like, no, and actually just pause for a moment and think about that phrase, the right to repair. Like, how did that ever become something that we just didn't assume we had? It's because all of us have been busy figuring out, like, how can we justify selling more product? And we have to think about what we're doing in a different way.
Yeah, so very true. We do want to talk about the affluence and that idea of a new affluence, and what does that mean, and what do we desire beyond just consumerism, right? Just to consume and buying things that are more valuable. And how do you move people in that direction of getting them to look at something and say, I don't see this as lasting 2 or 3 or 4 years, but lasting 10 or 20 years, right? And being able to see the price tag differently, I guess, right? I'm especially
you always
curious.
want to.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to address the price tag, which is that you always want to win on cost per wear, because cost per wear is also a way to reduce the carbon impact of any item. It's, if you wear something 5 times, you consume 400 times more carbon than if you wear it 50 times. Like, that's the kind of ratio that you're looking at when you really design for durability. But a really great thing that I think Steve Jobs said, and this is what we're trying to do as well. I love his phrase. I don't like everything about him, okay, but especially not the whole idolatry around him. I think it's very dangerous in ways that we can come back and talk about more later. But one of my favorite things that he said, because he was a fantastic marketer, was he said, educate, don't promote. And so, we really thrilled to that notion of spending time educating on what does the good life look like? What is ethical extravagance? What is this idea of eco-opulence? What do those things mean? How can you do it? And how does this garment work in that context? Like, how can you use it in that kind of lifestyle? That's what we're trying to do. And it's very fun.
Yeah. It goes against traditional. Oh, go ahead, Rick. Sorry.
Do you see what you're doing, Joy, you've got clear passion and expertise in this space around apparel, right? You also have a lot of passion around environmental risk and what we're all like looking at if we're paying any freaking attention. Are you blending? Do you see these as blending two things, your personal and professional, Or is it actually, well, no, this is really who I am, and I'm trying to make all of me show up in this thing, at least, what I want to put out there right now in the way of a new business? How do you define what you're doing there?
Okay, I swear this is going to be the last time that we mention Steve Jobs, but like part of why people do idolize him is because, and this was actually a big unlock for us at Patagonia when we were working on the Patagonia brand strategy, because we were, when you want to grow a company, you start by thinking like, okay, what do people really love about it now? Like, when does it have these breakthrough moments? And like, what was that about, And what we found is that people really loved Yvonne, like they love his story, and why do people love his story? Well, they actually love his story for the same reason that they love Steve Jobs' story, even though they have nothing in common. What they do have in common is they both are an example of self-actualization through work. And that is a very deep hunger that all of us have to self-actualize through the work that we do every day.
Mm-hmm.
And they both are just really, really great examples of that. So I definitely think, all of us, our whole lives, we're, maybe we're lucky enough to be doing this thing where we're like, man, I nailed it. You know what? I found that thing that I do, the only I can do, that I enjoy doing, that I'm getting paid to do. Those concentric circles are just lining up perfectly. Like if you're in that space, that's fantastic. But most of us spend a lot of time on that journey, like trying to line those things up. And some of us don't find it until much, much later. And then some of us are very successful when we find it, So I think for me, starting the company is definitely a part of my journey in terms of, I've gotten feedback that, given the things that I'm good at and what I want to achieve, this is what I should do. People think I should do it. It was never, women don't have a lot of role models as entrepreneurs, certainly not as venture funded entrepreneurs. The amount of venture funding that goes to women is only at 2%. Okay, 2%, and it stayed there for years. And so that means if you're going to go work for an innovative tech startup, you've got a 98% chance of having a male boss if you're a woman for a long time, until we shift that. That was the realm, where I had a network where I was able to raise capital. So I'm lucky to be part of that 2%. But for sure, it's always a balance between what do I bring to this uniquely and where do I need to get rid of my ego and get it out of the way? So that, and fortunately, this is one of the things I love about business is the feedback in the numbers, because you can get very clear signal in the numbers of like, wow, okay, that was very ego driven. People are not willing to pay for that, that ego-driven thing that I wanted to do, So it's time for a little self-awareness, time to realize that like, I am actually, to use another marketing expression, N of one. Do you guys know this expression?
Yeah.
For people who aren't in marketing, it may be a little bit old fashioned, but it's like your statistical sample is one. So your N value is one. And in some respects, we can find ourselves, okay, N of one, I am actually the only person that really likes that. And I'm putting it out there in the world and other people aren't. So, we very much, and this has a lot to do with the rise in interest rates. We've shifted away from this idea. And I think it's good, right? Of the founder who's just like self-actualizing, this is all a real expression of themselves, and towards the idea of leaders who are much more self-aware. And this is the space where I think women will really, really thrive in the future, because we have had to be so self-aware, because we have to think so much about what men in power are thinking, right? So we're very aware of how we're moving through the world. So I see it as actually a very positive shift for women in business.
Yeah, I love that. The honesty, well, and you're facing it as an entrepreneur, the fact that it's a truth serum. You can no longer lie to yourself. You can no longer lie to a general public. And there are some situations when we sit around and lie to ourselves. We think, oh, this is going to be great. Oh, it's not. Okay, great. Now I have to figure it out, right? And if you can't face that, you can't face those moments, those N of one moments. It is an interesting development. And I love that you're, in the middle of seeing that and making those adjustments and figuring it out as you go, because it is a whole nother skill set. And I agree with you that one of the things that I was once told, I'm not a woman, so I don't know, but I've been told that women see downside risk more clearly, more precisely, right? And so if that is the case, right, you're assessing things. So, so a man is more willing to jump out of an airplane than a woman is, right? Downside risk actually literal and metaphorical in that side, in that sense, right? It's just a fascinating application in the world of entrepreneurship, right? And being able to take those risks, develop as entrepreneurs, and then as more become entrepreneurs, they're coaching others to become entrepreneurs, right? Not even in an explicit way, just kind of just being there to be an inspiration coach in many ways, right? But it is still hard. It's for men, it's hard. It's going to be just as hard for women to do it, right? It's the same kind of thing as we face these challenges. So next question for you: are we becoming more or less globally aware as a society, do you think?
Way more.
Way more.
I think again, it's because of the climate crisis. It just, and also I go back to younger people who don't feel like they have the luxury of just, compartmentalizing that, right? So those of us who are, have more experience, like we've had to compartmentalize a lot, we're very trained in doing it. But I think the younger you are, the less you feel that that is a luxury that you can have. And as soon as you start thinking about emissions, then you start thinking about, okay, where's the bulk of it coming from? How do we get into this situation? So I think we're becoming more aware. It is it's very different to be in Europe because everyone here has always been much more globally aware, whether it's because of the role that Europe played in imperialism in the past and what it meant for that to end was very, very dramatic, whether it's, being in the center of world wars, the Cold War, all that stuff. I think people in Europe have always been much more globally aware than Americans have been. But I think Americans, I hope, are becoming more globally aware as a result of the dynamics that I just described.
Yeah.
I've heard you talk about what you're doing here in the context of, benefits relative to mission, which is just is an interesting concept all by itself. I mean, we hear a lot about this notion of, what's the benefit you uniquely own that is better than the next best alternative, and how can you lean into that? And I'm curious how you measure the difference between the benefit you uniquely own in this brand that you're building, right, relative to the mission that you are so clearly embracing.
I think they're the same thing. How would they be different in your mind? I mean, I think I'm just in a space, I'm in a world in which and this is by design, because I wanted to do work, when I set out to do, so when I set out to do this work, there were a lot of things I could have started as a business, right? Mm-hmm. And I could have started one where it's much, where the results are much faster, and we can talk about technology and software platforms and things like that. But I had to pick something that I would be happy doing, for the next 20 years. If that's, if I really like it, then I'll want to do it for the next 20 years. Mm-hmm. And so, a lot of thinking went into what that would be. And I mean, and a lot of thinking went into it on the one hand. On the other hand, it was just very instinctive. It was like, you know what? This is a gap. I see this gap in the market, especially when I talk to other women, they experience the gap. Like, let's just design into this gap, and of course that led us on a journey to think about, okay, what's the business model that's required to achieve the mission, and experimenting along the way so that we can quickly readjust if it doesn't work. Like, that's also a big part of a startup, is you need to be not too fixated on any one particular approach or thing. So it's interesting. There has been a lot of shifting already, and there should be, because a new business is by definition an experiment, and there will continue to be. But I think that, the mission and the brand have to be the same thing. And I think that's it doesn't have to be that way when you're working at a consumer products company with a portfolio of brands. Obviously that's different. If you're VF, maybe I'm sure VF has some kind of corporate mission, but it's probably so abstract you could drive a truck through it, right? Like, their mission must be you could probably say, like, anything on my desk does the same thing as what their corporate mission is, and they make clothes, mm-hmm. which are not on my desk. But when you really get into creating a particular, it's not really a brand, VF, it's a corporation. when you really get into building a brand, I think people are they have such a radar about authenticity, and they can sense so quickly when something is real and when it's not, that they have to be the same thing.
When you say the difference, so when I'm asking the question about the benefit versus the mission, in your case, what you're doing is you're making the mission the benefit. No, it's not. It's about what I'm trying to get at is it's about more than, you know, how does this thing feel? How does it work for me? You know, this apparel, right? And how does it? The bigger thing is how does it improve what I believe this world should be? Which is that going too far? That's kind of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Fair? Yeah.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think any clothing brand especially is always selling the idea of what you can do in the clothing, right? And if you want to live a life that's in harmony with nature, where you are very connected in that with nature, then everything about what we make needs to speak to that, you know, all the way down to the hang tags, which are made out of seed paper. And you have this experience when you open them that, you know, we invite you to plant that seed. You know, it needs to be throughout.
And the gap that you talk about filling here, this is real. I mean, this is really just interesting when you say, you know, there's a gap here. Just what is that gap? How do you define what the gap is?
So the gap, originally the gap came from us, meaning me and other women. First of all, feeling like in the outdoor space, the men's stuff is always cool and women's stuff is lame. What's going on there? Why? You know, why does orange become peach when it's for women? You know, why is a raincoat go from being, you know, something that you can layer a bunch of stuff under to being shapely? You know, like that was the first gap. But then there's also this gap between, you know, spending time in nature and in the city and just wanting to have like one coat that works, you know, one sort of outerwear system that works for all of that, right? Like when you go on a trip, you want to take the smallest suitcase that you can have. So if you run, you want to have high performance sneakers that look great with whatever else you're wearing. You want to have a coat that looks great when you go to dinner that you can ride your bike in. It's like there is the business model of these companies is deeply implicated in that lack.
It's not really well said.
The gap being the market opportunity to a certain degree that people aren't really seeing what the future could be. There's a little bit of, and it seems like there's embedded in what you're doing an optimism up against this pessimism of climate crisis. Right? There is a better way. We can open up something new, right? We can find better ways to do business.
I mean, so often, you know, some of the most wonderful things that we've achieved as humans, we've done through play. Like, I think we've done it by having fun. You know, I think that we have this, you know, too often work or the struggle and the struggle, like, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of struggle that's required to change things, but we also need to cultivate the energy to do it. And give it to each other, you know, the energy that we get from each other, the feeling that we have when we're working on this together. It needs to be something that we look forward to and that really lifts us up. So that's a big part of how we're getting the work done in that way. Yeah.
I would love if you tell the story, which I don't know how this has gone because we talked about it in the pre-call, but the NFTs. But the concept of it and what you were talking about is so freaking cool. Yet it might be too far out there a little bit. I still think I want it to be not too far out there because of the implications of that relative to the clothing you wear and where it goes after you and all the other implications.
You mean the idea of chain of custody that I mentioned?
Yeah, the chain of custody idea.
Yeah.
I guess it was more not the NFT, but chain of custody. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think there have been a lot of people involved in, especially in the marketing space, who've worked with this technology, who really see its potential. And the technology itself has a very serious branding problem. So I'm reluctant to talk about it right now because it's so tainted by crypto and by all of the scandals that have been associated with crypto have really tainted the potential of the technology. But the reason that we, have done any work in this space is to see, can it help us realize this vision of a more sustainable apparel brand? And the way in which that would happen in our mind is by providing transparency into the supply chain and into the future chain of custody. And it's that, the supply chain, people have wanted to understand that for, it's actually, I think it's one of those things where it's like, you ask people like, are you going to vote for Trump? And everybody's like, no. And then they go vote for Trump. Okay. So as a researcher, Rick, I'm sure you can relate to this. Everybody says they're interested in supply chain, but I really think that they're not. They don't say that necessarily with their behavior in their pocketbook. Okay. Sometimes it's a nice marketing story, but and this is the benefit of having been in the business for a while. So we put the QR codes on the tags at Patagonia 10 years ago when I was there, and you could scan the QR code and you could see the factory that it was made in. That was a decade ago, right? So the only difference that I think blockchain brings to that is like, you can really verify the provenance. I think there's a very limited number of categories where people care about that. It's like coffee, wine, cheese, maybe, you know what I mean?
Chocolate.
That's it.
But yeah.
Yeah, these things. But I think in clothing, and it's sad, I wish people did care more about it, but they don't consistently engage in that way. But where I think people are increasingly wanting to engage is in the circularity post-purchase and in sort of keeping garments in circulation. And, there's that sort of like, hand-me-down label in the garment where it's like, okay, this was Elsa's and then Elsa's name gets marked out and now it's Joy's and Joy's name gets marked out and now it's Anne's. And we've always loved seeing, well, if you're like the last person to get and the hand-me-down, you probably don't care about it. But if it belonged to somebody that you really admired, or if you just get a sense of, feeling like you're doing the right thing, which is a great feeling to have by seeing that it belonged to other people, that's something that I think this technology can facilitate. So we do have the ability to do that with the garments. We've sort of built that in, but we haven't actually activated that yet. It's still sort of like what we would say, like, on the roadmap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is such a cool idea. So out there on the horizon. No, that's I've always been fascinated by just, provenance or all things related to chain of custody of where a garment has been, on whose back, right? And also just the library card effect of signing your name to a garment, right? And then handing it on. It says more legacy things, right? You don't do that with the cheap fast fashion stuff. There's no way. Why would you? Because the next place it's going to end up in, hopefully, or not hopefully, it's landfill. Just that. But
this is a foundational thing, a lot of learning, Joy, just going through things that you've written and talked about. But I think it's kind of a foundational help here for the audience in front of you right now. Can you just share some of the facts about the degree to which apparel actually, and how it comes to be and how it goes away, just accelerates this whole environmental thing you're trying to also solve for? Yeah,
I mean, I always, after a conversation like this, I always give myself a stern lecture that like, you should have more of these facts and figures at hand. And I never do. So it's not, there are a few of them, like the wearing a garment 5 times, but I can speak to you. And actually, this is all very easily within reach if you go online and just Google like environmental impact of apparel. But I can hit on some of the big points, which are that the majority of the impact comes from the making of the material. It's very, very water intensive. There is a lot of waste downstream. Okay. So basically, and this also has to do with the detached relationship that we have with our consumers. We're making a lot of things, trying to put it in front of you, hoping that you're going to buy it, but a lot of it does not get bought. So about the most kind of like common estimate is about 80% of what gets made ends up in the landfill. But what we don't have good visibility to, and some people estimate it's as high as a third, never even gets worn before it gets destroyed. So that is truly, truly wasteful when you think that the bulk of the impact is in the making of the material. And the overall carbon footprint of, or the impact, the carbon emissions of apparel industry are more than commercial airlines and maritime shipping combined.
Say
So
that
a
one.
lot
Yeah.
Say that
more
one.
than commercial shipping, commercial flights and maritime shipping combined. And I will send you a source for that you can put in the show notes if you want afterwards. It's
Sure.
really, so it's either the like third or fourth most polluting industry. And actually you could say like, well, you know what, this is a really important industry. Like everybody gets dressed, you know, apparel has been critical to all kinds of market. Like we wouldn't even have capitalism if we didn't have looms. Same for computers, right? Like computers were invented to print jacquard. Like it's a very, very important industry historically. So, okay, you know, it takes a lot of carbon, like it has a big environmental impact. So what? It's really important, like energy, but not when you factor in the fact that so much of it is wasted. You see what I mean? It's like, you would be okay with making that if we all treated what we had with care and with love, and we, you know, it really worked for us. But when a lot of it just is, you know, getting returned, a lot of returns never go back on the sales floor. They never get resold again.
They're literally thrown away.
Anyway, I'm kind of, yeah.
You're saying this is as much as 30%, literally just straight to landfill or whatever, thrown away. They're not in market.
But there's just not a lot of transparency to it. So it's like, you know, a lot of this e-commerce companies will get together and talk about what their return rates are, and then what happens to the returns. And return rates have gone up have gone up a lot, as you would imagine, since the advent of e-com, right? Because when you're trying stuff on, you know if it's going to work for you or not. A lot of times people will order 2 at a time. It's called bracketing. And you order that so that, you know, you can keep one and send the other one back. You don't think that much about what happens when it goes back, but a lot of times it never gets resold. It just gets bent. But there's not a lot of transparency in this, and there are people doing good work in the space, but it's also not, it's like not a sexy thing to market on. It's a little bit like the supply chain thing, you know what I mean? So the solution to this isn't like, you know, to shame people into understanding that, oh, you know, that one thing that you bought looked good on you, that came from a store that threw away everything else that they made. I think that the solution is to put the care and attention into what you're making and into the experience of selling it so that people get what they want and there's not a lot of waste on the other end of it.
Yeah. When you talked about Steve Jobs' quote about educate, don't promote,
right,
or whatever the alternative, which is in the world of marketing, traditional marketing, education is expensive, right? And it's typical marketers would say, no, we don't educate. We just meet the consumer where they are, which is easy. And also there's a lot of in fast fashion and things related. It's just easy, right? There's no friction. It feels like we need more friction, right? We need just a little bit more friction, right? To create a little bit more heat or intensity around these subject areas so people can actually see it. Even just your last point about how easy it is to buy and ship back. And like, there's costs to that beyond just the shipping costs itself. That why are we doing this, right? It doesn't make any sense.
And I think people are, I think people are hungry. You know, friction is like the opposite of what you want to achieve in any kind of sales environment. And I think that's why people, you know, why you have people thinking themselves more deeply about what they're consuming, right? They're like, wow, this really has gotten too easy. You know what I mean? Like in some of the research that we did with our community recently, one of the guys was like, wow, you know, I got a flight for like $50. You know, at first I thought like, wow, it's so great. And then I was like, wait a minute, this is terrible. Like, you know, is this great? You know?
Yeah, there was a recent thing that came out about McDonald's, and people were saying it's too fast, like slow it down a bit. I want my food a little bit slower. And to McDonald's, I'm sure that like everything about them is speed. So for them to hear slow it down, it's like, what? How do we do that? We don't even know how. That would go completely against their thinking.
Yeah. Well, this is probably the most shocking difference in being in Europe versus being in the States, especially in France. Like France is absolutely filled with friction. Like it's, and that has the impact of keeping people employed, like, you know, and slowing things down in a way that kind of heightens the pleasure of the experiences that you're having. So it's living here, you know, and I have such admiration for this culture and for this country. And I'm very grateful for having been here during the pandemic, especially. They, you know, I think people love to come here as tourists because you can almost just feel it. You know, when you walk down the street, you're like, wow, what's happening? You know, everything's, you know, there's like all kinds of people around. They're walking, they seem happy, they're sitting at the cafe, it's like really beautiful, you know, and a lot of that is because there is a lot of friction in the culture. You know, it's like an exercise in, you know, how laid back you can be, how not taking yourself too seriously you can be. And that, you know, we could all use a little bit more of that. Like, we're not necessarily like the thing we need right here, right now isn't necessarily the most important thing. You know, it may feel like we've been trained to think that as consumers, but that may not be the case. And so, yeah, it's one of the most remarkable things about being here.
Yeah, fascinating. So, and the business environment is different. We talked about this as well. There is a lot of friction in entrepreneurship there. More challenging, I think, than most markets.
Yeah, I mean, it's a learning curve, you know, and it's like there's a lot of, it's a learning curve. And once there's so much that's great about being here. You hit these obstacles and then you're like, okay, well, now I know, you know, now I know that's how it works. And like, let's move on to what we were doing before.
Right, right. That's nice.
When, you know, give the experience that you've had, and really the global orientation of what you've been doing and are doing today. Could you just share some of your perspective on, I want to call it like a American contextualization? How when you look at, as it relates to consumerism, it's maybe too easy, and as it relates to like environmental awareness and activism and competency, and go there. How do you look at the States relative to other parts of the world on those two kind of metrics?
I could talk to you about this for hours. So I'm just taking a pause to figure out what the most important things are to say. So first of all, Americans are much easier to target as customers because they are much more engaged in social media, and it's just a bigger market, right? Mm-hmm. So performance marketing is still a part of almost everyone's arsenal, even though it works way worse than it has. I mean, it does not work as well as it used to, but it still works to a certain degree, and it's still a useful tool for learning, actually. But in the US, you can still build businesses that way, right? And you can't do that in Europe because, first of all, e-commerce is not as developed. Second, people are not as glued into social media as they are in the States. And so they're very different markets in that way. And the thing that matters more over here is actually craft and experience. And I think that is where the world is going, okay? Because I think America is starting to wake up to the shallowness of some of the things that we valued. I think the other thing about America that's really interesting is it's just so much more of a precarious culture. You've probably heard this expression, the precariat, but that kind of anxiety really, it's part of why it's easier to sell to Americans, right? Because what a lot of people do when they're selling is like preying on your anxiety, right? Sort of like, I'm gonna like, you know, the oldest example in the book, and this is terrible marketing thing that I learned at the very beginning. It's old enough that I can tell it, okay? But like one of my first jobs was like writing concepts for Johnson's Baby when I worked at J&J, right? And every marketing concept was like, you want to do the very best thing that you can for your baby, right? You know? And then it's like, that's why blah, 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 blah. You know, that's why J&J sells. So in some ways you can see all of marketing just in that little example. It's like, you know, you really want this, don't you? But you're worried that you can't, so we can help you, which is like a terrible, you know, kind of terrible approach. Mm-hmm. But all of American culture is that way. And I think a big part of why it's that way is because there is no social safety net, right? And so it fills Americans with a lot of like useless, frantic energy, you know, that you just, that you don't have as much of here, where, you know, you're going to be able to have, chances are you're going to have good childcare. You know, our kids were in school here for all of but 2.5 months of the pandemic. Schools were open the whole time, except for 2.5 months. And so I think people are bringing that to their relationship to brands. They're bringing that to their workplace. And that, you know, it's not really happening here. But as a result, I think people are more and more interested in how, you know, what life is like here, and in trying to bring that back to the States and sort of put those things into practice. But the difference of a social safety net is a really big deal.
That's a driver.
Sorry?
That's a driver, as you see it.
Yeah, the lack thereof is a driver. Okay, so one great example would be financial services. You know who doesn't need a lot of financial advice? Someone who has a pension.
Yeah.
Right? You don't need to be your own personal banker understanding, you know, how diversified are you? ETFs, between the three of us, we could rattle off a dozen acronyms of things we really don't care about that have to do with our financial planning. You don't need any of that if your taxes are just withheld from your paycheck, which is how they are here. And when you retire, you get a pension.
Yeah.
All that entire industry just kind of goes away.
Yeah. It kind of speaks to the being more of a specialist in life and not having to be a generalist, not having to go learn financial services when you're not that. It's just not part of your, in order to have your own level of security financially. It's
Oh,
challenging.
don't gloss over that point, Aaron, because that is one of the greatest, I think, luxuries that we have, that we can afford ourselves, is the luxury of actually going really deep on something that we're interested in, right? Like that is, you know, you can just feel the joy that you get from organic discovery when you're able to go really, really deep, you know, on a subject that you're interested in. It's an extravagance, and it's great.
Yeah. It's that almost that you can achieve that pinnacle in life when you can, and if people find that valuable about you and valuable in the economy, that you've gone deep on something. Really,
you can find out all about how to do it if you subscribe to our newsletter.
Nice plug. Well done. Subscribe here. We'll put that in the link on the
newsletter. We're going to tell you how to do it on Sunday.
That's wonderful. I love that. Absolutely love that. Very appropriate. I love the fact that you were talking about like the third most hideous industry. And you've said, no, I know this, I'm heading into it, and I'm going to be in this industry and change the industry. There's a little bit of talk out there of like, and I've seen this happen in some areas of our community, in the advertising community, I should say, not our community necessarily, but that, you know, you stay away from industries that are hideous, right? So like in the oil and gas industries, you could say the transportation industries. But I would make an argument that you go into those. If you've got these belief systems that could change things, you go deep in that. Don't like, well, no, we don't want to do anything in that industry, right? I just want to work with the good industries. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Then the industries that are perceived as bad, you know, are going to be left without the change makers, the people that come in and rethink it. I don't know if you've experienced something around that or had any feedback on that as it relates to going into fashion.
I think that, yeah, I do. You know, that to me, this separation between the physical and the digital world, I mean, you know, in some ways it doesn't exist, but when it comes to capital, that like, you know, transformational capital is a thing. It's all deployed in technology, and almost none of it is deployed in the real world. So your instinct is very right, and I'm backing you up on that to say that it's, you know, it's more difficult, but perhaps more important if it turns out that like these are the things that are really driving the climate crisis, or these are just actually things that people are really engaged in and get a lot of joy from. It's totally worth working on that.
Yeah.
It's important. We have to do it. We got to find a way to do it.
Right. Yeah, we need to evolve the economic systems that we're working with, because they have evolved to get to this state. They certainly can continue to evolve. We don't have to be stuck in this status that we're in, for sure. It's lovely to see those things happening. And Rick, do you have one more question before I ask what people should be reading beyond just your blog and your newsletter? I'm going to ask that question as well. But Rick, you have another question?
You know, honestly, I just it's a real pleasure meeting you, is all I want to say. And your approach is I mean, you're naturally inspiring. I think you know that about yourself. You are, and it's your passion in what you're doing here. It really does come through, and I do hope that you can share with folks here before we're out of time. How to follow you, right? How to follow you, how to connect with the brand that you're creating, both personally and in business.
I will do that, but I'm going to get at one other thing that you said you were going to ask me, but that you didn't ask me, which gets back to this idea of like me being inspiring. Everybody can inspire in their own way. And one of the things that you were going to ask me is about culture and sort of like how to build culture. Yes. And I just want to take a minute to talk about that, because we embrace this concept of that we call positive deviance. And deviance is usually something that you think of as bad, which is why it's coupled with positive. And there are many, many ways to do it. And if you're someone who is optimistic and, driven by ideas and things like that, then you may come across as more energizing to others. But I want to, I think it's important to realize that we all have different ways of energizing each other. And, Aaron, you mentioned, okay, sometimes women can see more of the downside, but that's some people's character that they can see those things. And finding a way to actually, share them with a group in a way that's constructive, that allows the people around you to work through the risks that you see is so important. So, so positive deviance is kind of the practice of how we sort of build culture. And I'd encourage people to kind of explore that concept and read more about it, because it's really important to us. And it's been important to me on my journey that I'm still on.
I love that. Absolutely love that. That is, I agree. There's just seeing downside risk more clearly can be like, well, could sound negative, could sound like, oh my God, no, it's not that necessarily. Just being able to see it more clearly and avoid those risks and help people see other routes around those risks, essentially.
And people have different, can I say one thing about risk budgets? Are we out of time?
No, keep going.
Okay. So the other thing about risk is that people have different risk budgets, right? We all have, we don't think about it that way, but we all have sort of like a portfolio of risks that we take. And one of the most interesting things that I've ever learned about the outdoor industry is, and this I think could probably also relate to entrepreneurship, is that there's a theory that women don't participate in as many action sports because they're very risky, and the risk of physical violence physical pain is very intense, and that women kind of carry that with them all the time in life, right? Like we have more risks in our everyday life than men do, right? Because of the power dynamics and how we think about, people in power react, or simply because of men sort of making overtures to women, right? Like, and anytime, there's a risk in turning someone down, right? So it's like, I'm just giving you examples of different risk calculations, and that some women who feel like, okay, well, I'm taking a lot of risks all day, every day. I don't necessarily need to like rip it up on a, BMX bike or something like that. That's not, I just want to go, for quiet walk in the woods. I just want to go sit in the grass for a while. And I think we need to, and actually I would say that like more and more people want just time outdoors, just time to connect with the nature, not necessarily to do anything or conquer anything or achieve anything. So, your question is, where am I achieving? Where can you follow me and keep in touch with me? That was the actual question that you asked.
Oh, good.
That's funny. We got nowhere near that.
So I'm so at Early Majority is we're not very active on Twitter because we're disillusioned by what's happened on the platform. We just pop up there every now and then if something really important is happening. We are still active on Instagram, so it's at Early Majority, earlymajority.com. And then personally, I am on LinkedIn and do respond to messages there, and also respond on Instagram, and I'm Joy Rocker on Instagram.
Okay. So one last point before we finish, because I think what you pointed out about, the downside risk and men taking greater risk. It's also that little stat out there that men generally don't live as long as women. And that might somehow correlate to your idea of men taking stupid risks, right? When you bring up the BMX bike and all kinds of the other broken bones and the stuff that men do to destroy their bodies or other things, right? They don't live as long. You get the benefit of living longer, on average, generally speaking, which is wonderful. Joy, this has been an absolute joy. I love this. I love that we entered Joyland and had a conversation that hopefully was inspiring for everyone else. This has been a great example of these events, these Think Alike events. Thank you for spending time with us. I feel like we have a whole bunch of other things. We didn't even get to the questions like you mentioned that we wanted to cover culture. We could have gone further in that. We didn't talk about X at all. We really should have talked about Twitter/X. So at some point in time, we need to have you back and go deeper again in other conversations. And we will, of course, because we lost Barbara on this due to illness, we will have Barbara on the stage as well in the future.
Yeah, big shout out to Barbara, who, by the way, is based in France, head of Decathlon. For those of you guys don't know, I mean, if you're here, you probably know who she is, and you're bummed she's not here. Like, I'm bummed that she's not here, but a very exciting company. She's recently become the CEO. They're super excited to see what she does with that company. It's a legendary brand in France, and also a very inclusive and open approach to sport, which was something that I'd hoped we talked about. But since she's not here, I'm going to wish her Godspeed with what she's doing at Decathlon.
Yeah, and part of putting these things together, there's a little bit of like, I want these two people to know each other. Enjoy, you and Barbara. I wanted you two to know each other. So I hope you still, even if it takes a little while, meet and connect in some way, because the two of you should be in a friend group together in some sort of, book club or whatnot, because the two really pair up nicely. So, and thank you, Rick, for being my guest host and for your thoughtful questions as well. And of course, we go beyond the hour, which is fine and dandy and wonderful. We have a number of these coming up. The last 3 months are all set. We have some amazing guests coming up. We'll be back in person and virtual at the same time on the next 3. But again, thank you, Joy, for spending the time with us. Truly inspired. We're getting a lot of wonderful little claps showing up, as well as comments. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.